Hello everybody and welcome back to Sam's Finance, where I talk about all things personal finance, and today we're going to do a deep dive into an article I wrote about Bitcoin's origins and the workings of blockchain technology. I welcome you to join me for this lesson, and I'm going to start reading now. Bitcoin's origins. Bitcoin's ideological origins can, among others, be traced back to the Austrian School of Economics around Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. The focus of this school is on the individual and on the unimpeded markets as a means of information. It is critical of the institution of central banks and fractional reserve banking, and sees them as the reason for the boom and bust cycles in the global economy. This happens through the central bank's manipulation of the key interest rate, which sends out wrong signals to the economic system and thus leads to malinvestment. In this way, the Austrian school directly contradicts prevailing Keynesian economics, which today prompts central banks around the world to try to reduce economic fluctuations and keep prices stable through their monetary policy. Additionally, the Austrian school of thought is in favor of a currency that is directly pegged to a commodity, as it was in the days of the gold standard, so that the money supply cannot be arbitrarily expanded. According to Mises' regression theorem, today's so-called fiat money, which relies solely on the public's faith and trust in the central bank's monetary policy, can only persist if the government forces it upon people. Friedrich Hayek therefore argued in 1976 that governments should not have a monopoly on currency, but that there should also be a kind of private money which would consequently open up competition for the best preservation of purchasing power. This would lead to the emergence of very stable currencies, and at the same time keep the monetary expansion of the government's fiat money in check. Similarly, the monetary school around Milton Friedman rejects any form of government intervention in the money supply and the economy in general. In a fabled interview in 1999, Friedman predicted the development of a decentralized, anonymous e-cash that would emerge on the then young Internet. Meanwhile, in the early 1990s, the libertarian cyberpunk online community had formed to use new cryptographic technologies to spur a shift towards a truly free and more self-determined society. A monetary system untethered from governments was visioned as absolutely necessary and as a major step in the empowerment of the individual over the state and its centralized institutions. It was primarily intended to protect the private sphere, which was seen as the greatest good and was threatened by the authorities. The exchange of new ideas on the cyberpunks took place through mailing lists. While initial concepts for digital private money had developed promising cryptographic technologies, they all failed on the overall construct, which lacked either in decentralization, transparency, or security. These early projects include eCash by David Chaum, Hashcash by Adam Black, the reusable proof of work algorithm by Hal Finney, B-Money by Y. Dai, and BitGold by Nick Szabo. On October 31st, Halloween, 2008, the unknown pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, on one of the cryptography mailing lists. Bitcoin would be able to eliminate the usual need for trust in institutions and intermediaries by replacing it with cryptographic proof through systematic decentralization. The pervasive role of trust in the traditional financial system becomes clear in a few places according to Nakamoto. First, central banks must be trusted not to expand the money supply too sharply, too fast, so that there is no severe inflation that erodes wealth. Commercial banks must be trusted to maintain sufficient reserves at all times to continue performing withdrawals and transfers. Furthermore, if one utilizes a third party, one simply runs the risk that this third party might deny access to one's savings, will not allow certain transactions, or can determine the terms and conditions. To use these services, one must also give up one's privacy to the intermediary and trust that it will handle the sensitive personal data with care. For Bitcoin to become the solution described, cryptographic breakthroughs were required that are subsumed in its technological dimension. The breakthrough and the workings of blockchain technology for beginners. The hitherto need for a trusted company to process a payment was for the central authority to administer a database of customer credit balances in order to ensure that no participant could spend his or her credit balance more than once. This is because, in contrast to paper cash, amounts or pieces of money in digital databases can easily be copied perfectly, and hence there is a risk of the same piece of money being spent twice. Bitcoin's greatest achievement, therefore, is to have found a solution to the double spending problem. It was for this purpose that Satoshi Nakamoto developed blockchain technology, a decentralized public accounting ledger. The blockchain contains the entire transaction history of all transactions made from the very beginning. The components of the chain are called blocks. They contain a number of transactions, which depends on the block and transaction size. Bitcoin has a predefined block size of 1 megabyte, and transactions average 550 bytes in data size. This results in an average of almost 2,000 transactions that can be bundled in one block. Irrespective of this, a new block is added about every 10 minutes, and thereby continues to update the ledgers with new transactions that have taken place. Each new transaction is broadcasted to all nodes in the network. Every single one of them holds a complete and constantly updating copy of the ledger and subsequently takes part in a consensus process. For this purpose, essentially a digital signature is used to check whether the sender is also the owner of the coins and whether, on the basis of the transaction history, the sender has sufficient balance in his account to fund the transaction. The digital signature consists of an individual pair of public key and confidential private key that each network participant possesses. Although each transaction must be publicly distributed on the network, privacy is achieved by the fact that the public keys are pseudonymous and each transaction can use a new one. The signature that protects each transaction is a function that depends on the transaction and the private key of the payer, and therefore cannot be easily copied because it's different every time. Through the verification of the nodes, it can thus be ensured that the sender has legitimately owned the coins at least once. However, because the network is so widely distributed, there is no guarantee that the transactions arrive at all nodes in the same order in which they were conducted. The risk of a double spending event has therefore not yet been eliminated. In order for all nodes to share the exact same transaction history, the Bitcoin white paper described the use of a timestamp server. These timestamps ensure that the blocks are lined up in a chronological order. In addition, the timestamp server makes a hash of the overall block, which in turn is incorporated in the header of the subsequent block, and thus also links all blocks directly with each other to form the chain. A hash function thereby produces two completely different, equally long, but entirely unpredictable outputs for even similar inputs. To implement this mechanism and to decide which block should be added next to the chain, when several nodes create different blocks at the same time, Bitcoin uses the proof of work to establish consensus. This is a system inspired by Adam Black's Hashcash mail spam filtering system and is based on the SHA-256 hash function. A block is only considered valid if it has proof of work. Therefore, in a kind of mathematical competition, particular nodes that have previously recorded the new transactions are looking to solve a riddle, which in turn would prove to the network that enough work in the form of computing power has been undertaken. This riddle entails finding a number by sheer trial and error whose hash begins with a certain number of zeros. The nodes that participate in this challenge are called miners. As soon as one of the miners has found this special number, he broadcasts the block to the network, whereupon the solution is checked by all nodes. Once the block is validated, the nodes add it to their copy of the blockchain. Whichever miner is the first to have discovered the correct number is then compensated for his work with a block reward in the form of newly created coins. This not only incentivizes many miners to participate in the competition, but is also the solution for bringing new money into circulation. In the case of Bitcoin, this remuneration was initially 50 coins per new found block, but is halved every 210,000 blocks, about every 4 years, as a result of the so-called halving event, and currently amounts to 6.25 coins. This codified mechanism makes Bitcoin's inflation highly predictable and ultimately leads to the fact that there can never be more than 21 million coins. A commodity like gold is thus mathematically virtually simulated. Another source of income for the miners derives from the transaction fees that the initiator of a transaction has to pay, which vary depending on the urgency. Conversely, the proof of work difficulty is adjusted in line with the computing power active in the network, with the aim of keeping the average block time always at 10 minutes. More miners or more advanced computing devices therefore both lead to an increased difficulty. In the case that two miners find the solution for the same block at the same time, a fork occurs, among other things because the blocks could also contain different sets of transactions. As a result, the total number of miners will be temporarily split between the two chains. However, it is unlikely that the next block will be found again by one member of each of the two chains at the same time. Therefore, the Bitcoin protocol specifies that, in principle, the longer blockchain should always be pursued because it unites the greater proof of work effort, therein reflecting Bitcoin's democratic majority decision-making, in which one processor equals one vote. The miners will therefore watch which chain finds the proof of work for the next block first, and then unite behind the longer chain again. This is also an important security aspect against fraudulent blocks that contain untrue or fraudulent transactions. As long as the majority of nodes is honest, the minority of malicious nodes will never manage to maintain the longer chain in midterm, as they are inferior in computing power and capability. The more blocks are added, the more secure the older transactions are considered to be, so that after 6 blocks, about 60 minutes, it is assumed that irrevocable settlement has been reached. Since Nakamoto mined the first block on January 3rd, 2009, 2 months after the white paper was published, there has only occurred one vulnerability in the protocol, which was fixed in 2010, making Bitcoin's blockchain unhacked to this day. In this Genesis block, Nakamoto also hit the message The Times, 3rd of January 2009. Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks, which refers to the headline of the Times newspaper that day. This can be understood as a symbol for the failure of the centralized financial system and draws a direct link between the financial crisis and the beginnings of Bitcoin as the first decentralized, governmentless system. I hope you get something out of that, and then I will see you when we both are back. Have a nice week. Bye-bye.